Are you following a gluten-free diet and miss meatloaf because of the breadcrumbs? I have a solution for that. In this video, I will demonstrate how to make a delicious meatloaf using gluten-free rolled oats instead of breadcrumbs. I'll also be making a side of Redskin potatoes with the creamy horseradish topping. Hi, and welcome to the channel, where I will be cooking good food as well as counting carbohydrates. My name is Elizabeth, and I'm a type 1 diabetic. And those of us with type 1 diabetes can eat anything without restriction. So I will be preparing a wide variety of tasty meals and then showing you how to count carbohydrates to determine insulin requirements for the dish. Also, most of these recipes are gluten-free or can easily be made gluten-free with a few tweaks here and there. So please stick around until the end, because after cooking the dish, we'll sit down together and rock and bolus, and of course, count carbs. The ingredients are ground beef, eggs, ketchup, garlic, onion, Parmesan cheese, milk, and seasoning with garlic powder, onion powder, salt, pepper, and Italian seasoning, rolled oats, potatoes, sour cream, and horseradish. I begin by finely dicing a chunk of onion to equal a 1/4 cup. Any kind of onion is fine. I'm using a yellow onion. Slice one direction, turn 90 degrees and slice through the other way. I add onion in part for the flavor, but also to add moisture to the mix so the meatloaf doesn't dry out in the baking process. In a large mixing bowl, I am adding all of the ingredients listed on the recipe except for the ground beef and oats. My rule of thumb is to add 1 egg for each pound of ground beef. I'm using 2 pounds, so 2 eggs. Crack into a bowl and whisk lightly. Add diced onions, freshly grated Parmesan cheese, milk, ketchup, seasonings, and here I'm using garlic and onion powder, Italian seasoning, and pepper. None of these have any measurable amounts of carbs, so season to taste. Add Jarlic. Now add the ground beef and start mixing everything together. Here I'm using an 80 by 20 mix of beef, anything with a lower fat content, and you may end up with it being a little bit too dry. Make sure you wash your hands before starting. Here you see me using my kitchen boa to dry my hands. Wear this and no more hunting around for the elusive kitchen towel. I love these kitchen boas. Dig in and start mixing. I always mix with only one hand and keep the other out of the pot, clean and dry, just in case company comes to the front door or you need to answer the phone. Well, that's what my mom and grandma always taught me. Mix until everything is well combined. The meatloaf should be a tad sloppy wet at this point. I need to firm up my meat mixture. If you are carb counting, then the oats you use are a major source of carbohydrates that will need to be counted. So I start with 2 cups of oats in a separate measuring cup. My oats of choice are Bob's Red Mill. I love this company. Then I remove a 1/2 cup at a time from the measuring cup and add to the meat. Mix it in. If your mixture is still too wet, then add another 1/2 cup or 1/4 cup at a time. Plop into a baking pan and spread out evenly. I'm using a disposable 8 by 8 inch tin pan. You'll notice that I'm not putting a topping on my meatloaf, and that is because when my kids were younger, they wouldn't eat the meatloaf if there was a sticky sauce on top, so I always put the sauce on the side for anyone who wanted it. Put the meatloaf into the oven, bake at 375 degrees for 1 hour. There is no need to preheat your oven, just pop it in. For the potatoes, wash and chop into bite-sized pieces. Add to a pot of water. I boiled mine for 12 minutes, just enough time to take out the crunch, but not so mushy that they lose their shape. For the potato topping, I'm adding a 1/2 cup of sour cream into a small bowl and then horseradish. Horseradish and sour cream don't really have measurable amounts of carbs, so you can adjust to your own spice level. I started with a 1/2 teaspoon of horseradish from a jar, tasted, and then decided to add another 1/2 teaspoon. It's always easier to add more if you want it, but you can't take it back if it's too much. Horseradish is one of those oftentimes forgotten flavors that can be added to a dish. It has a very pungent smell. Your nose and eyes will recognize it before your taste buds do. It has a taste similar to wasabi and is a quick and inexpensive way to add spicy heat as well as flavor to a dish. I also seasoned with some fresh ground pepper and parsley. Remove the cooked meatloaf from the oven after an hour. Let set for a few minutes before slicing and then plating. Slice the meatloaf, add the potatoes, top potatoes with sour cream and horseradish. Enjoy. Before I begin the actual carb count, let me say that I am not a medical professional. I am just a human being who happens to wear my pancreas in my pocket. I also happen to have years of living with type 1 diabetes. I was diagnosed in 1964. If you do have a medical question, please consult your diabetic care team. Let's begin the carb count for the meatloaf and potatoes. There will be some math involved, but don't worry, it's not that hard. Now this recipe made 6 servings, and I'm going to add up the carbohydrates for this entire recipe and then divide it by 6. So the ketchup had 16 grams for the entire recipe. The Jarlic had 3 grams for the entire recipe. The onions had 4 grams. The milk had 2 grams. The ground beef had 0, eggs had 0, Parmesan cheese had 0, the seasonings that I used had 0, and the oats had 66 grams of carbohydrates for that entire 6 servings. You add that column up, and that's going to come out to 91 grams of carbohydrates for that entire meatloaf that you're going to put in the oven. You're going to divide it by 6, and that's going to come out to 15 grams of carbohydrates per serving for the meatloaf. Now onwards to the potatoes. The red potato had 35 grams per serving. The sour cream and horseradish each had 1 gram, and the pepper and the parsley that I used had 0 grams. And you add up the 37 grams for the potatoes, the 15 grams for the meatloaf, and you're going to come up with 52 grams of carbohydrates per serving for this meal. If you add ketchup to this meal, you're going to have to add that into your carb count, but I didn't use any ketchup outside of what I had initially put in. And a lot of people like to drink beer with meatloaf and potatoes. I didn't drink any, but if you do add beer, you're going to have to add the carbohydrates with that as well. Once you have your final carb count for your serving, you will need to divide this number by your carb ratio number. For instance, if I use my carb ratio of 1 to 15, 52 divided by 15 is equal to 3.5 units of insulin needed to keep my blood sugar within a normal range. Happy carb counting, and remember, my fellow type 1s, counting carbs so our pancreas doesn't have to, one meal at a time.